Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, our guest today is one of my personal favorite people, Don Dennis. Don Dennis is the creator of healingorchids.com, and he's been making Living Tree Orchid Essences for the past 25 years. And we have interviewed Don Dennis before about orchid essences and about his aura sprays. Welcome, Don Dennis.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine.
So Don Dennis comes to us from the lovely Isle of Gia in Scotland. So Don Dennis, you and I were chatting before we started our recording because you just made a new orchid essence. And so this show, if you like orchids, this show is for you. If you are interested in flower essences, this show is for you. And if you're interested in using orchid flower essences in a new way in your healing practice, this show is for you. So Don Dennis, will you share with us briefly about your new essence, Radiant Courage, that you just made January 1, 2024?
Right. So our essences look like this, okay, in these little 15 ml bottles.
Okay, and for our audience who can't see, it's a little bottle with a photograph of an orchid on it. Yes. Okay.
Okay. So the woman that inspired my interest in orchids about 26, 27 years ago is a person named Shabad Sangeet Khalsa, known to her friends as SSK. And she was the first person in the world to make flower essences with orchids that were being grown in a greenhouse environment. And I met her 26 or 27 years ago, and she then came to our premises after the Findhorn conference, and we had a seminar there that weekend before she flew back to California. And in her seminar, she just spoke with such passion about orchids themselves that you couldn't help but kind of be infected with the enthusiasm. And so on the way back from dropping her off at the airport, I stopped at a garden center and I bought an orchid. Well, 9 months later, it spoke to me one night and told me to make an essence with her. And that's how the Living Tree Orchid Essences began, with that very first essence that is called Unveiling Affection. Interestingly enough, Unveiling Affection was made with a hybrid orchid. And one of the parents of that hybrid is a species called Phragmipedium besseyi. Now, SSK had made an essence with Phragmipedium besseyi, and it was her bestseller. It was called Radiant Strength. And I never wanted to step on her toes. So it was a good 10 or 12 years into my essence making before I ever dared make an essence with Frag besseyi. And the one that we made at night. And it has particular qualities because of being made at night that really make it quite different from Radiant Strength. A few years later, I made a besseyi essence by daylight, just daylight. And we call that Higher Courage. It was good, but I always felt as though there's something more with besseyi. And then January 1st, I walked into our greenhouse intending to make an essence. Okay, I was going to select one of the 4 or 5 orchids that were in bloom. I knew that. And it was a lovely day and I felt relaxed, and I set foot in the greenhouse, and immediately the Frag besseyi that was there on the shelf was just singing out, saying, make an essence with me. There was no choice. It was hands down. It was like the vote was 100 to 1 for that against any other. Bragg Bessiai was not going to let any other orchid be made into an essence that day. And so I brought it into the essence making cabin, and it over the course of 22 hours, it does a partial, what I call partial immersion in the water. The pouch of the slipper orchid floats on the water. It won't, you can't push it down in. I tried once, and it's not a pleasant thing. So it sits on the water, a few millimeters of contact with the water. And I left it from midday on the 1st until 10 a.m. on the 2nd of January. And it's a beautiful essence. It's a humdinger. It's so powerful. It restores the sense of courage to your heart and helps you to absolutely feel you're able to move forward. And I don't think that in these 25 years I've ever made an essence that I felt has such universality. That is, virtually every person on planet Earth right now could do with drops of this essence. And it's just a gobsmackingly beautiful energy that's also quite profound. It's hard to convey exactly what goes on with that, but you'll have seen in the newsletter that I just sent you, Catherine, the beauty of that orchid. Fire Engine Red. Its discovery in 1981 in Peru is regarded generally as the orchid discovery of the 20th century.
Wow, that's quite a statement. Now,
Yeah.
as I started this broadcast, I talked about how this show, if you love orchids, this show is for you. If you like flower essences, this show is for you. And if you want to find additional tools in your healing practice, this show is for you. Now, Don Dennis, you and I have discussed before on the Natural Healing Show the healing power of the Living Tree Orchid Essences, and how orchids are the most evolved flowers on the face of the earth. So they make very powerful flower essences that are especially helpful for our spiritual growth. In addition to this, in addition to making flower essences, you also photograph the orchids that you raise. And
Yeah.
I if anyone goes to CatherineCarrigan.com and looks at any of my blogs or pictures, you'll see I also raise orchids, not quite as amazing as Don Dennis. However, all orchids are amazing. And I can attest how actually difficult it is to take photographs of them, right? I'm always I just use my little iPhone, but trying to capture the beauty and power and splendor of the orchids.
You really want something like a nice camera, like a Nikon or a Canon with a good macro lens, and you want a tripod, and you set the orchid up in a room where there's no air movement. You want it on a tight f-stop, and go for a 3 or 4 second exposure. You know, it's to get really good photos that, you know, it's a bit of expensive equipment to begin with, but I spent all that money 20 plus years ago. And beyond that, though, you have to feel a kind of obsession with capturing the spirit of the orchid. So there's very much a question of what angle, how close you are to it. You know, you experiment with it. And so over 25 years, I've accumulated a lot of photos of the orchids, and I've enjoyed that. I've enjoyed it a great deal. And it turns out that having something of an obsessive interest in photographing the orchids has also a very important benefit if you're making flower essences like I do, because it's ultimately led to the creation of this deck of orchid healing cards.
Now, Don Dennis, in the past, you have made beautiful cards with photographs of the orchids on one side, and on the other side, you've had text description in English. And I know that orchid essences are used by healers all over the world. but the photo on one side, the text description in English on the other side. And in addition to that, you've made orchid greeting cards. And true confession, I'm such an orchid nut. I have one of Don Dennis's orchid photos blown up over my bed. It's angelic canopy. So those of you who appreciate that one. And then I have 5 of his orchid cards framed in my bedroom, so that when I wake up and open my eyes, the first thing I see is orchids.
You're one of the few that bought those orchid greeting cards. Wasn't very good at marketing them, I suppose.
They were amazing. And then, of course, when I go down to my healing room is full of orchids. So for our audience, many of us are already familiar with flower essences and how to use flower essences. What are the Living Tree Orchid Essence healing cards, and how can people use them in their practice?
Okay. So let me explain. About 15 years ago, we brought out our first set of cards, and they were actually like poker size, the poker playing card size. And that was handy. It gave us something. They were so cheap to print, we practically gave away most of them. We learned a lot from it. And then a few years later, we felt the need to bring out a larger size of card. And so we, about 10 years ago, nine or 10 years ago, we published a deck that had, I think it was 127 cards in it. And they were 3.5 inches by 5 inches. So roughly the size of your standard tarot deck. All of those cards had the advantage, as you described, of having the text description for each essence on the flip side of the card. So you look at the photo and then you can flip the card over and read about the healing qualities. For this new edition, I have to say, our colleague Adrian, Dr. Brita Babapule, whom you've interviewed, he's been on at me for the last 2 or 3 years to update the deck. Don, there are so many cards that we need, so many new essences. I mean, we're about over 50 new essences since we brought out the earlier edition of the cards. And finally, everything came into play this autumn. And so the deck has 184 cards. And let me just pull a few out.
So Don Dennis, could you explain for our audience, that is just stunning. So those of you who are listening, John Dennis showed me some of the cards with his beautiful photographs. So Don Dennis, the Natural Healing Show is listened to.
You can call me Don.
Don. I use your full name for our audience benefit.
I know.
So how can healers from around the world use your healing cards in their practice? What are some practical ways to use the orchid healing cards?
Right. So, do you mind if I go into that a slightly different approach?
Absolutely.
I've been thinking about it, and basically there are 4 main uses for the cards. Okay. One is that anybody interested in orchids could find them very interesting to look through, or you could, if you're a therapist, you could share about the orchids with your family and friends, because you're looking at just what hopefully you'd regard as really beautiful photos of the orchids. And then you're also, in this instance, not overpowering them with the text on the back, because on the back of each card, we simply give the name of the essence, the name of the orchid, and then it also says in subtle green letters, Living Tree Orchid Essences. We chose with this edition to remove the text description from the flip side of the cards. And that's for a very important reason that applies to the second and third major uses of the card. First, the cards, beyond education, the cards are the best tool that we have to offer for diagnosing either another person or for yourself. And I'll explain more about that in a moment. They can also be used for direct healing, not as powerfully as the essences themselves, but the cards do have a healing power. The photos have an energy. I pull up this one with a little bit of hesitation, but because this is called Shadow Warrior Phalaenopsis, Bulbophyllum phalaenopsis. There is an energetic quality that you pick up just by looking at the card. And I was thinking about this the other day. In all those movies they have of World War II airmen flying out on a bombing mission, the pilot puts the photo of his girlfriend or his child or his wife, in front of him in the cockpit, right? Well, you could think, well, why? Surely he's able to just remember the girlfriend, remember the wife, remember the child. But the photo holds something about that person. It conveys an energy to that person. In the same way, the photos done well, and we've done our best to produce them well, these orchids are a direct link to that healing energy that the orchids hold. So some therapists work with the cards, laying them on the body. Okay, so one that might be wanted to heal the solar plexus, you could just put it directly onto the solar plexus. If there is a point of trauma that like, oh, I can see that you got pierced by a Roman with a spear 2,000 years ago, then place the orchid photo facing the body on the body as you're lying there. Something of the healing quality of that orchid will come through. Now, by removing the text on the flip side, it's made the cards energetically cleaner. And Adrian noticed this as soon as he got the new deck. And he said, it's great, Don, because we don't have the energetic interference that we sometimes had with the earlier deck. So it is an improvement on our earlier deck for anybody that happens to already have the earlier deck.
So Don Dennis, would this be a good time to explain for our audience what is the doctrine of signatures and how can looking at an image of an orchid call up the frequency and the healing power of the orchid?
Okay, I would regard that as two distinct questions. But yeah, doctrine of, when you put to me by WhatsApp this morning, could I talk about what doctrine of signatures? I had to stop and think about it because it's been a long time since I've thought about doctrine of signatures. But that's not because I don't think of it. It's because it's second nature to me now. So on a simple level, if you have a flower that's red, it's going to be in the field, generally speaking, of energizing. If you have just a second. So here's another energizing, right? A white orchid is very likely to be something to do with purity and purifying.
Can you hold it up a little bit higher for those who can see? Yeah.
This is a curious one. It has to do with protection. And the notion of protection is very much seen in the doctrine of signature of it, because this is part of a much larger leaf. And
what flower essence does that orchid make?
Knight's Cloak. It specifically protects the back of the throat chakra. I should say, as an aside, over the years, we've ended up developing more essences for psychic protection than I think anybody in the world. We have a lot of essences for psychic protection. You see an orchid like that, and it's not surprising that
It's
this
pink.
orchid, it's pink. The orchid spoke to my old essence making partner, Heather DeCam. She said, make an essence with me. I'm about compassion. And it is an essence called Wisdom of Compassion. There's one, though, that I'm specific. Oh, yes, this one. Now, this is not an orchid. A few of our range are not orchids. This is a rhododendron species. But doctrine of signatures would suggest that that would be a calming essence. And it is indeed. Rhododendron griffithianum, very deeply calming and relaxing, to the degree that somebody doing massage can use drops of it on muscular tension, and the muscular tension just disappears like butter on a hot plate. But with the orchids, doctrine of signature becomes, well, can get in the way. I mean, if you're fixated on doctrine of signature when you're dealing with this orchid, you know, the intellect is just going to say, well, I don't know. But it's an extraordinary essence of innocence, a primordial quality of innocence that this orchid holds. And another one that, frankly, doctrine of signature blinded me to, maybe because I'm just not clever enough in relation to the doctrine of signature, but one of the best essences we have to help promote sleep by itself is this one.
And the name of that orchid essence is?
So this is, we call this one Serene Overview. And you look at it and it's like, well, what is the serene part? You've got this orangey red. Surely that's energizing. Well, the orchids can be a little complicated. Sometimes, by the way, they can be also pretty direct and straightforward. This one is a bulbophyllum, a species from Southeast Asia, and it wants to attract its pollinator with an odor. And the odor of this one is excrement.
Okay. And
guess what? It helps on an energetic level, helps your large intestine. It does a lot more than that too.
And the name of that essence is?
Internal cleansing.
Yes. Now with that, we've been having such a great time. I've overlooked stopping to listen to a message from one of our commercial sponsors here at UK Health Radio. You're listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author. Our guest today is Don Dennis, and we're talking with him about his Living Tree Orchid Essence cards. We'll be right back.
So is this like a 30-second?
You're listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author. We're interviewing Don Dennis of healingorchids.com about his Living Tree Orchid Essence cards. Now, Don Dennis, before the break, you were saying that there's 4 purposes to your Living Tree Orchid Essence cards. Education, so people can learn about orchids and learn about the orchid, the Living Tree Orchid Essences, diagnosis, healing, and also inspiration. Mm-hmm. So how can people use your Living Tree Orchid Essence cards for diagnosis?
Okay.
What does that mean?
Yeah, so let me explain. Let me also just sidetrack for a moment. I wanted to show one last card in relation to the topic of doctrine of signature. Because if you look at doctrine of signature, what is this orchid about?
I would have to think on, I would have to meditate on that. So yeah, it's a very unusual looking orchid. Yes.
Yeah. So it produced an essence that we call Soul Dancer.
Mm,
And it's a profound essence about lightness of being.
mm.
Okay. So it would be good, for example, for anybody who takes themselves too seriously. So I have to go back about 35 years, well before I was making essences. There are two people in Western Australia, Vasudeva and Kadambi Barnao is their name, and they have a company called the Living Essences of Australia. And to the best of my knowledge, they were the people that came up with this diagnostic technique. Okay. They produced a set of flower cards that were based on the, I think, 88 flowers that they worked with. And there was no text on the flip side of the cards at all, as far as I can recall. But and so then the photo was just, here's this flower. And the very first time, the first day that we got a deck of the cards from them, when we were down south, my office manager and I were looking through the deck of cards, and this mauve, pale purple flower card appeared, and Margaret went, "Oh my God, that's so beautiful." And for me, it was sort of like, it's just a pale purple flower. I mean, it did nothing for me, but it made Margaret kind of swoon. Okay. So I went to their book and I looked up that pale purple flower. And as I read what it was about, it gave me this very precise insight into what was going on emotionally within Margaret at that point, to the degree that it was embarrassing. I couldn't even talk about it. It was like, okay. What the Barnaos came up with is a form of what I call visual kinesiology. Your eyes are doing the muscle testing. So the technique is basically, it isn't willy-nilly. There's a technique to it. You go through the cards pretty quickly. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, you don't have to be talking, but it's about 1 second per card. Okay. And there will, after maybe 10 or 20 or 30 cards, suddenly there will be one that just jumps out at you. And it could be, look at that. Or it could be, oh my God, isn't that gorgeous? It's a strong response that one is looking for. Okay. Now,
And so for the therapists, the healing practitioners who are listening to your broadcast, so they would actually hand the deck of Living Tree Orchid Essence cards to their client, and their client would go through looking at the photo.
It's actually easier for the therapist themselves to flip through the card for the client, i.e., you're sitting there facing each other or side by side, doesn't matter. And the point is that the client won't know the technique and the timing. The client will probably say, "Oh yeah, that one reminds me of my grandmother," and "Oh, look at that, isn't that it?" You don't want all that. You don't want to be addressing the intellect. You don't want to be addressing your memories of childhood. It's literally just a second of visual reaction, to the visual input from the card. And maybe, if suddenly that card goes, "Oh, wow," then that's all that's needed. The client just needs to keep their eyes open. And in my experience, the therapist is better at doing it to the right rhythm and timing. Okay.
And so
now, but there is one other thing that you have to say. We have 184 cards. That's a lot of cards to flip through. So a clever way to do it, and I heard this from Adrian, I've also heard it from others, is divide the deck either into 2 or 3 or 4 equal parts. Okay. And then just ask the client, pick one of those. One of those 3 decks or 4 decks is going to be pulling you. And then have them flip, then you flip through the cards of that quarter of the deck. Okay. And that's a quicker way of doing it. Then you're only flipping through about 45 cards and you're doing that in about a minute's time. There will likely be 3 or 4 or 5 cards that have jumped out at the person, okay? And 4 or 5 essences would be kind of the general maximum that I would recommend. But if the therapist, it is going to be down to the therapist, but if the therapist feels let's keep it to just 3, then have the client at that point prioritize the 3 that they had the strongest response to.
All right, so to summarize this for our audience, so if a therapist, a healing practitioner wanted to use the Living Tree Orchid Essence cards, they would get the deck, they would divide the deck into 3 or 4 bunches or piles. They would ask the client to pick the pile they feel most drawn to. And then the therapist himself or herself would go through and set their intention to identify the cards that are going to be most beneficial for the client. And then,
but also the therapist will say to the client, look, I'm going to flip through these cards, but when you see one that really jumps out at you, tell me. And then the therapist will set that card aside, but then keep going. Don't stop with that card, just set it aside and carry on through the whole group of cards. And any card that jumps out at the client, they should say, oh, that one.
So it's literally the therapist showing the cards to the client and the client reacting to the cards, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And so
because that orchid, the photo of the orchid is speaking to the semi-conscious psyche of the client and is eviscerating an immediate response. If it's not the orchid that client needs right then, it'll just be, oh, that's okay. Oh, that's okay. So but there will be, I guarantee, as you look through the cards, there's going to be 1 or 2 that just, whoa, jump out for the person.
So at the end of the day, the client is selecting the orchid card that is most beneficial with the therapist going through. And then once the client has chosen the 3 or 4 Living Tree Orchid Essence cards that are helpful for that individual at that time, how would the cards be used in the context of a healing session?
Well, some therapists would then perhaps have the client lie down on the couch or table on their back, and then they'd place the cards, the photo of the cards, face down onto the person, onto their torso, forehead, whatnot. And that will give them, and then just silence, for the next few minutes to allow them, their subtle body to absorb some of the benefit from the photo of the orchid, okay? But then the most important follow-up to my mind is that the therapist ensures that the client then either goes home with that selection of essences or knows where to order them. And it's a common experience for therapists that the client says, yeah, I'll order them when I get home. And then they don't. Half the time they don't. So you have to work on that. But if you're in the States, Southern Herb carry the range. If you're in the UK, they can order direct from us, and we get the essences out to people quickly. Some therapists will hold a full inventory of the all 184 essences with them, and then they will sell the 3 or 4 bottles to the client, and then once a week the therapist is placing an order with us to replenish their kit. That there are various ways, but I wouldn't rely just on the cards. The cards are, it's not even 10% of what the essences can provide, but they are giving a healing energy. There's no question in my mind that they do that. But if you really want the client to be experiencing the full benefit of how the orchids can help to heal their past life trauma, present life difficulties, etc., then ensure that they get the drops. And I should add right now, don't dilute those drops. We put them into a 15 ml bottle, take the essence under the tongue straight from that 15 ml bottle. We do not encourage dilution, which is commonplace in the flower essence field. You're simply getting a much, much weaker impact if you dilute essences.
And with that, let's take another break and listen to a message from one of our commercial sponsors here at UK Health Radio. This is the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 bestselling author. We're interviewing Don Dennis, creator of HealingOrchids.com. So Don Dennis, creator of HealingOrchids.com. Earlier in this interview, you spoke of visual kinesiology, which is basically the practitioner showing the orchid essence cards to the client and the client selecting the orchid essence card that seems to have the most impact. What is the difference between visual kinesiology and typical muscle testing? Why wouldn't you just use the muscle testing with the orchid essence cards?
Really, I'd say that to understand how to work in standard kinesiology with the orchid essences properly involves many months of training. There are different levels of, say, of stress. There are many receptors on the body that where you can do specific muscle testing. Our colleague Adrian, Dr. Brita Babapule, has over the years mapped out these many receptors. It's a lot of work to become that skilled kinesiologically. The nice thing about the orchid cards is that you don't really need a lot of training in order to be able to use them skillfully. The most useful skill for working with the orchid essences, apart from being sure that the client has two eyes, is getting the right sense of timing, flipping through the cards. You don't want to do it too quickly. Boom, 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 boom. No, that's a little too quick. But you don't want to linger on each card. You don't want 3 or 4 seconds per card, because then you're allowing time for the intellectual response to come in, for the wrong part, as it were, of the brain to kick in and say, oh yeah, that reminds me what my father did when I was 7 years old and he flew off to what. You don't want all that stuff. You just want, wow. You want the boom response. And so this is the beauty of it. It's kind of like having, with the deck of cards, okay? It's like having an incredibly skilled, very experienced therapist who understands the orchids deeply right there at your side, telling you which ones are going to be best for you or for your client right now.
So
and it's that simple.
Dennis, you have a manual for the Living Tree Orchid Essences. The name of the manual escapes me, but I actually use it every day in my work. And it has a chart with the energy points that was developed by Dr. Adrian, and his name is quite difficult. So anyway, Dr. Adrian. So this chart we can use to the way I use this chart when a client comes to see me in person is I check all their energy points to begin with to make sure they're energetically neutral. And if they're not, then I do techniques to clear their energy so they can get in neutral, and so that I can communicate with their higher self.
Is that the chart you mean?
Absolutely. So the chart is called the Healing Centers and Essences. And will you give everyone the name of the manual?
Well, I could and I couldn't, because I think we have about 10 copies left.
Oh dear.
But,
Orchid Essence Healing. Okay.
but bear with me. Can you bear with me for about 30 seconds?
Okay. So I'll speak with our audience while Don Dennis is looking for
Oh,
the
I found it.
manual. So,
Hang on.
okay. So we have
Sorry.
a new manual. Okay. And the new manual is called the Living Tree Orchid Essences and the Orchid Healing Card. So tell us about this new
So
manual.
I used, this is the 64-page guide to accompany the cards. Okay. And I used those body maps that Adrian created as the front and back cover. And that way you don't have to try and fold the book open to keep it flat and so on. You can just plunk it down there on your table and you've got the reference. Okay. Now, in case you end up having the front and back covers dirty with time and usage, we also included those body maps and other body maps inside the booklet, if I can find it.
So when people purchase the Living Tree Orchid Essences, they'll also get a manual with this body map that will explain to us how to
Yep.
identify which Living Tree Orchid Essence a client may need.
Yep, exactly.
So Dennis,
There's other things in it, like a photo of the essence making, and so on. But yes, I guarantee the body map is both on the cover, yes, and also inside, so that you can have it folded open like that. But this also, we took the text descriptions off of the cards to make the cards energetically cleaner, and instead they're in the booklet.
right.
And the booklet comes free when you get the cards.
So when those of us who want to learn more about Living Tree Orchid Essences, when we purchase the deck of the cards, then the updated manual, which is expanded and has more photographs and definitions of your newer essences, will also be in the new deck, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, Don Dennis, earlier we talked about the 4 purposes of the cards: education, diagnosis, healing, and the last one is inspiration. So tell us how we can use the Living Tree Orchid Essence cards for inspiration.
So, sure, a good many of your listeners will remember were they called angel cards that came from Fintorn. And they're just little cards with like love, or some beautiful little phrase on one side of the cards. And you could have them in a bowl in your front hall, and once a day you just pick out a card for inspiration for the day. In the same way, you could use the orchid healing cards for inspiration. You could just go to the deck once a day or once a week and pull a card out at random and look at it. And if you want to, then also read about it from the booklet. That's the simplest way of finding inspiration with them. Okay. There's 184 different cards. So you could have, if you did one card every second day, then the deck is going to last you a whole year, right? For a daily, a 2-day inspiration card. But in the same way that people do, say, tarot card readings, I am sure that there are people out there who'd be able to use the orchid healing cards with different types of layouts and intuitive selecting of the cards to seek inspiration that way. I dreamt about a month ago that I was talking with my father, who is currently 97 years old. And he was telling me that he felt that the orchid healing cards could be used by people in some way in connection with their birthday to find inspiration.
Mhm.
And that kind of got me thinking on the whole subject, because it's not a conversation I would normally have in waking hours with my father, ever. But it was a very clear dream, and I listened to those clear dreams. So I think that there's potential for people in looking through the cards to find inspiration in relation to their daily life. Absolutely.
Great information. And I know for myself, I set up my healing room very intentionally. And as I mentioned, my healing room happens to be full of live orchids. So there'll be different ones blooming at different times, but people walk in the room and they immediately say, I feel better just being here, because we know that environment is the most powerful factor. And as I mentioned earlier, I have framed some of your previous beautiful Living Tree Orchid Essence cards in my bedroom, so that when I'm waking up, that's the first thing that I see.
That's great.
So Don Dennis, creator of Living Tree Orchid Essences, and now this new set of cards. And then how many cards are there in the new deck? You said 184?
Correct.
Any final thoughts for our audience?
Well, it was really just this, that over the years I've spent so much time photographing the orchids, so much time growing the orchids. These are all photos of orchids that I have grown. Really, the orchid healing cards are kind of a culmination of my life's work in print. I don't think there will be another updated edition of the book. I'm hoping the booklet is good enough for that. But the cards absolutely needed an update, and I'm really delighted with them. I think the only thing I might now do is I have to make one card for Radiant Courage to be added to the deck. But I think it's a rich treasure trove, the card deck, that people in any number of different ways could find rich to explore.
You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 bestselling author, also orchid lover and orchid grower, not to the extent or the expertise of Don Dennis. Our guest today has been the one and only Don Dennis, creator of Living Tree Orchid Essences and the cards. You can find out more about Don Dennis and his wonderful work at healingorchids.com. And remember that orchids are the most evolved flowers on the face of the earth. And when you engage with them in fluorescence form, you can heal yourself naturally. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.